Theory of poverty in the light of the contemporary economic crisis, industrial cycle and impoverishment. The process of impoverishment of the working class takes on its most acute form precisely during periods of commercial and industrial crises, if we consider this process in the course of the cyclical development of capitalist production. In the other phases of the capitalist cycle, during depression, revival and upsurge, the process of impoverishment of the proletariat, although it does not stop, does not receive such exposure and acuteness as in the phase of economic crises. It is in this phase of the cycles that workers are deprived of all means of subsistence precisely because they have produced these means in too much. This is the generally recognized position of revolutionary Marxism. Lenin, in his critical notes on the draft program of the RSDLP, insistently noted this idea, in contrast to the author of the draft program, Plekhanov, who was generally not inclined to attach serious importance to the issue of poverty and poverty of the masses under capitalism in the program of the then Social Democratic Party. Pepper, noting the process of impoverishment of the working class, which is a natural necessity under capitalism, wrote that the commercial and industrial crises further exacerbate this process, that they lead to an even stronger deterioration in the position of the working class. In the program of the Workers' Party, Lenin attached great importance to the issues of impoverishment because the process of impoverishment of the working class clearly reveals the entire exploitative, antagonistic essence of the capitalist mode of production and shows the workers that as long as capitalism exists, the workers cannot free themselves from the chains of wage slavery. The individual partial gains of the working class by no means eliminate the process of impoverishment, since they cannot eliminate the fundamental foundations of capitalism. Therefore, the struggle for partial demands must be linked to the struggle to overthrow capitalism. Only this overthrow can put an end to the process of impoverishment, as has been practically proved by the October Revolution and socialist construction in the USSR. All the social formations that have existed until now, corroded by class contradictions, were characterized by poverty, hunger and oppression of the masses. True, each formation had its own specific laws that determined poverty and oppression in a given society. Nevertheless, exploitation and poverty did not disappear. Each new social formation gave rise to immanent factors of impoverishment. Capitalist society is also organically characterized by the exploitation and poverty of the working masses. Only a socialist society liberates the working people from poverty, oppression and exploitation. The history of peoples knows many revolutions, said Comrade Stalin. They differ from the October Revolution in that they were all one-sided revolutions. One form of exploitation of the working people was replaced by another form of exploitation, but the exploitation itself remained. Some exploiters and oppressors were replaced by other exploiters and oppressors, but the exploiters and oppressors themselves remained. Only the October Revolution set itself the goal of abolishing all exploitation and eliminating all exploiters and oppressors. The only correct analysis of the position of the working class in capitalist society is provided by Marx's theory of impoverishment. Not a single anti-Marxist doctrine was able to accurately explain the fate of the working class under capitalism, since they apologetically defended the rule of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, the specific features of the gigantic impoverishment of the proletariat and working people in the current world crisis can only find correct coverage from a Marxist standpoint. But before moving on to an analysis of the characteristics of impoverishment in the current economic crisis, we will try in this chapter to consider Marx's theory of impoverishment in the light of the development of the capitalist cycle. Studying the laws of movement of capitalism, Marx established that the basic law of capitalism is the law of surplus value, which reveals the exploitation of the working class in bourgeois society. The transformation of labor power into a commodity as a result of the deprivation of the direct producers of the means of production is the factor that puts the stamp of wage slavery on the position of the proletariat in capitalist society. And since this wage slavery exists, and it can be abolished with the violent overthrow of capitalism, insofar as the development of capitalism reproduces on an expanded basis the relations of production between the eligible class of wage workers and the exploiting class of entrepreneurs. By this means the growing army of hired robbers increasingly deepened the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The decisive moment in the impoverishment of the working class is the formation of an industrial reserve army immanent in the capitalist mode of production. Marx established that with the development of capitalism, the relative demand for labor gradually decreases, as a result of which a relatively surplus working population is formed, which cannot find a productive use for itself under the capitalist mode of production. This population forms an industrial reserve army, against the background of which the law of supply and demand for labor moves. At the same time, the concentration and centralization of production lead to the concentration of wealth in a few hands, and the masses of small producers are ruined, replenishing the ranks of hired workers, these slaves of capital. During economic crises, the reserve army of labor grows enormously, pressing with all its weight on the position of the working class. But in other phases of the capitalist cycle, this army of unemployed continues to put pressure on the living standards of the working class, although not with such a force as during crises, since it is significantly reduced. The industrial reserve army, or relative overpopulation, wrote Marx, during periods of stagnation and average revival, puts pressure on an active workers' army and curbs its claims during periods of overproduction and paroxysms. Consequently, the relative overpopulation is the hairdryer on which the law of supply and demand for labor moves. It squeezes the scope of this law into boundaries that are absolutely consistent with the thirst for exploitation and the desire for domination inherent in capital. Relative overpopulation, being subject to fluctuations in different phases of the capitalist cycle, however, cannot completely disappear as long as capitalism exists. On the contrary, the greater the accumulation of capital, the larger the relatively surplus population or unemployment, the more the process of impoverishment of the working class proceeds. During crises, however, the impoverishment of the working class is further intensified. This is the absolute, universal law of capitalist accumulation, which conditions accumulation of poverty, corresponding to the accumulation of capital. Relative overpopulation, which is a product of the development of capitalist industry, in turn becomes a lever of capitalist accumulation and even a condition for the existence of a capitalist mode of production. The movement of the industrial reserve army or overpopulation thus becomes a form of cyclical development of production. If the contraction of industry in the phase of crises increases the reserve army of labor, then the convulsive expansion of production in the phase of exploitation of human material, without increasing the number of workers, regardless of the absolute increase in the population. Relative overpopulation becomes a factor that ensures the change in the phases of the capitalist cycle. With each new capitalist cycle, the relatively surplus population increases. The accumulation of capital, accompanied by changes in its organic composition, relatively decreases the demand for labor with the onset of each new cycle to an ever greater extent. Crises during which unemployment reaches its maximum in each given cycle, in turn, serve as the starting point for a new change in the organic composition of capital, since the crisis is always the starting point for large new capital investments. The material basis of the cycles is based on such a factor of capitalist production, which constantly reduces the demand for labor in comparison with the amount of capital. This is the movement of fixed capital. During crises, the renewal of fixed capital almost ceases, but in this phase of the cycle such conditions of competition are created that force the capitalists to renew fixed capital, which usually begins in the depression phase, intensifying in subsequent phases of the cycle in order to almost stop again with the onset of new crisis. An increase in the organic composition of capital with the onset of each new cycle is associated with this peculiar movement of fixed capital, which is the material basis of the cycles. And the growth of the organic composition of capital means the growth of a relatively surplus population. During the period of the general crisis of capitalism, the monopoly bourgeoisie goes to cut production costs in accordance with the market conditions that are created in the phase of the economic crisis, not so much along the line of renewal of fixed capital, as along the line of additional pressure on labor force, in the opinion of a new intensification of labor. The renewal of fixed capital in the current crisis is observed mainly in the military industry, which finds its explanation in the rivalry of the imperialist countries in military preparation for a new redivision of the world. It would be grossly schematic to consider that against the background of the general process of impoverishment of the proletariat under capitalism, it is impossible to temporarily improve the position of certain sections of the workers. Through stubborn class struggle, the proletariat is achieving partial successes, sometimes even significant ones. Marx never denied the possibility of an increase in wages in a capitalist society, although he considered the main tendency of the capitalist mode of production to be a tendency towards a decrease in wages. He wrote, "In times of prosperity, great expansion, acceleration and vigor of the reproduction process, workers are full-time. As a rule, wages also rise, somewhat equalizing their fall below the average level. In other periods of the industrial cycle we see that Marx believed that the rise in wages somewhat evens out the fall in wages, but does not cancel it. The general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise, but to lower the average level of wages. The antagonistic nature of the capitalist mode of production means that a temporary improvement in the situation of the workers is a stormy petrel of a new deterioration. Every crisis, wrote Marx, is prepared precisely by the period when a general increase in wages occurs and the working class actually receives a larger share of that part of the annual product that is intended for consumption." A few lines below, Marx wrote that the conditions of capitalist production allow the relative well-being of the working class only for a time, and even then only as a petrol in relation to the crisis. Marx wrote about the impoverishment of the proletariat in the era of industrial capitalism. With the onset of the era of imperialism, the position of the working class deteriorated even more. The gigantic exacerbation of capitalist contradictions under the rule of monopolies, and especially during the period of the general crisis of capitalism, modifies the industrial cycle precisely by the p. in such a direction, which further enhances the process of the impoverishment of the proletariat, since the phases of revival and upsurge become sluggish, partial, even more short-lived. Especially uneven, covering not all countries and not all industries, but phases of crises and depressions, long, deep, acute and general. For example, before the current economic crisis, England experienced a severe economic stagnation for 3 whole years. Unlike the crises of old capitalism, the current crisis was not preceded by a general phase of upsurge and prosperity. The upward wave of the conjuncture in a number of capitalist countries could not bring the industry of these countries out of the state of stagnation. But even in those countries where the current crisis was preceded by an upswing, the upward wave of the conjuncture did not cover all branches of industry. For example, in the USA, such industries as coal, textile, etc., experienced a deep depopulation in the best years of the notorious prosperity. In the era of monopoly capitalism, the process of impoverishment of the working class generally intensifies in all phases of the capitalist cycle in comparison with the era of pre-monopoly capitalism. In contrast to Kautsky, who believes that the class contradictions under modern capitalism are being blurred, that the position of the working class is improving, Lenin noted that the rule of the monopolies widens the gap between a handful of insolent billionaires drowning in filth and luxury, on the one hand, and millions of working people, eternally living on the one border of poverty, on the other. All this cannot but mean for the working class an increase in oppression, a worsening of its material and political situation. Capitalist monopolies are fighting for the appropriation of monopoly profits, one of the main sources of which is every intensification of the exploitation of workers, both sellers of the commodity of labor power and buyers of personal goods. Under the rule of the monopolies, the conditions of red-haired labor are sharply worsening for the proletarians. Wages in the era of imperialism tend to fall more and more below the value of labor power than they did under free competition capitalism. Even bourgeois statistics make it more difficult for them to conceal the tendency of real wages to fall. This tendency is so clearly exposed in the era of imperialism. On the other hand, high monopoly prices exploit the workers and the toiling masses additionally as consumers. It turns out that in the era of monopoly capitalism, workers sell cheaper their labor force, while the cost of living index rises. This phenomenon reveals one of the sides of the intensification of the process of impoverishment of the working class under the rule of monopolies. The gigantic accumulation of capital and wealth at one pole corresponds to the gigantic growth of poverty, torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, savagery and moral degradation at the opposite pole. It is on this basis that the export of capital develops, which has become typical of modern capitalism, as well as the parasitic character of imperialism. Lenin noted, along with certain other conditions that make the export of capital necessary, also the poverty of the masses. As far as the parasitic character of modern capitalism is concerned, it too largely feeds on the intensification of oppression and exploitation of the working class. First, the exploitation of oppressed nations and colonies means, first of all, an extreme deterioration in the position of colonial and semi-colonial workers, who are subjected to double exploitation. Secondly, bribery of the upper strata of the proletariat, the labor aristocracy, presupposes, along with the annexation and exploitation of colonies by a handful of great powers, the robbery of the broad masses of the metropolitan workers who contribute their share of the tribute to monopoly capital. The difference between the upper stratum of the workers and the proper proletarian lower stratum acquires decisive significance. Thirdly, monopolies generally use worse-paid workers. In the category of worse-paid workers, along with foreign imported workers, it is necessary to classify women workers, the use of labor of which is growing under imperialism, unskilled workers, etc. From everything that has been said about the position of the working class under the rule of monopolies, it is clear that the intensification of the process of impoverishment of the proletariat is quite natural for imperialism. Naturally, in these conditions, the economic crisis cannot but entail a much greater deterioration in the position of the working class than is it about came during crises under old capitalism. Lepin, continuing the work of Marx in the era of imperialism, revealed the reasons for the intensification and aggravation of the process of impoverishment of the proletariat under the rule of monopolies.